Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Parliamentary Library in Georgia. Thank you all very much for coming. Tonight's talk is brought to you by From Training, an educational organisation that endeavours to foster a deeper understanding of the historical and geopolitical situation between Russia and Ukraine and the Caucasus, a vital endeavour at such a critical point in this region's history. You may already know, in addition to running lectures such as this one, Forum also runs a year or more programme for students like me and like you who are studying Russian. This is a fantastic opportunity to study here in this wonderful city of Tbilisi, and I would like to ask the audience to give Ben, Sofa, Anita, and Ariola a huge round of applause for the excellent work that they're doing. I'd like to take a moment to introduce to you our speaker tonight. It's an honour today to be joined by Diana Magnay. Diana is a leading voice in war correspondence and has over a decade's worth of experience under her belt, covering Russia's ever-evolving movements, from the invasion of Crimea in 2014 to the invasion of Ukraine. Diana is currently on sabbatical, having returned to the UK after spending 6 years living in Moscow, working as a Moscow correspondent with Sky News. She also spent 8 years working for CNN as the international correspondent, working in London, Johannesburg, and Berlin, the latter between 2010 and 2014, where Diana was heavily involved in reporting on the rapidly unfolding crisis in Ukraine, including protests on the Maidan, the annexation of Crimea, and the war in Donbass. Diana's career follows on from an accomplished academic record: an MA in International Peace and Security at King's College London, which she completed before joining Sky News in 2018, a degree in history from the University of Oxford, and proficiency in multiple languages. Although I hear she's not yet fluent in Russian, and I can bring breaking news to you all that I've seen her name on the register for next week's Russian lesson, so it's only a matter of time. Tonight, Diana will be in conversation with Felix, the foreign correspondent for Reuters, who currently lives and works in Tbilisi and is tasked with covering Russia, Caucasus, and Central Asia. It's such a privilege to have you both here with us tonight, and I'd like to ask the audience to give Diana and Felix a hugely warm welcome, and I hope you all really enjoy our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for such a lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming. It is a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Felix, for hosting this conversation, which I think we speak for about 45 minutes, and then please ask any questions that you have.
Yeah, let's get underway. So we've had a great introduction to Diana and her life and her works already, and so I don't know. So Diana and I were sort of in Moscow at overlapping times, and I can definitely say she was a big name in the foreign correspondent community in those years. But I wonder, maybe we could start off with sort of I suppose, how you got to this point, how you sort of A, entered sort of the journalistic world, and B, sort of drifted in that direction of Russia and of Ukraine and of this kind of part of the world.
Yeah, so I started as an intern at CNN in 2000, where I was pressing the auto cue with my foot from midnight until 8 a.m. every day or every night. And I sort of climbed up the greasy pole since then. And that was just before 2001 and the 9/11 attacks. And I thought then that sort of our lives would be coloured by the war on terror, because that was just such a sort of huge, for years after that, that was pretty much all we were discussing. Although I do remember producing shows when Beslan happened, the attack on the school in 2004. And Russia for me then was, something that I didn't really know very much about. I wasn't like you, I hadn't fallen in love with the literature or studied the language at university. So Russia was somewhere where lots of my friends after university had gone, and they'd sort of spent their 20s in Moscow and come back and written books. And for me, it was still completely distant. And then I went to Berlin as the producer there in 2006 or 7 or something. And my first foreign assignment, or in fact, my first war, and one of my first foreign assignments was here in 2008, when Georgia and Russia had their short 5-day war. And I remember having been in Berlin sort of dancing the night before, and there I was suddenly running away from a Russian fighter jet and thinking, what am I doing here? What the hell? And I didn't know then that, that was 16 years ago, which is really amazing. I didn't think that I would be spending so much of my time covering Russia. But from Berlin, I went and did some bureau cover in Moscow in 2013, just sort of as the Maidan was kicking off in Ukraine. And it was a crazy week where I just suddenly felt this kind of, I was totally bitten by Russia. There was this trial going on of the Bolshoi director who'd had acid thrown in his face by one of the ballet dancers, or by somebody, an ex-convict who was recruited by one of the ballet dancers who had a gripe against Sergei Filin, who was the director of the Bolshoi, and he'd thrown acid in his face, and Filin couldn't see anything anymore. And this trial was just completely nuts. And in the courtroom, the ballet dancer and the convict were basically allowed to just talk about all the terrible things that Filin had done, kind of favoritism and all this sort of internecine backstage rivalry, and I just couldn't believe it. And I couldn't believe how cool Moscow was. Because in 2013 it was just, new restaurants were opening, it was becoming very hipstery, it was kind of fun and exciting. It was just after the Bolotnaya protest, there was a lot going on, and I kind of just wanted to cover it. And then the Maidan started, and that had a momentum all of its own. The annexation of Crimea, the war, lots of Navalny demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg over the next few years. And then the Sky job came along in 2018. So that's when I went there full time.
Mm-hmm. And so we had kind of vaguely overlapping stints in Russia. So I was there 2017 to 2022 when the war started, and you were there from 2018 and quite a long way into the war until early this year, right?
Yes.
My impression, or my sense, was that Russia changed an awful lot in the 5 years that I was there, and I imagine you saw quite a lot more change in your time.
Yes, I mean, the 2018 when I went there was just, I went there a month before the Skripals were poisoned in Salisbury. So that was obviously a massive story for Sky, and it was a real, I was like, whoa, I don't know very much, and this is the biggest story that there could be for the UK. And that was very exciting. And then in the summer there was the Russia World Cup, which was this moment of incredible euphoria for Russia, and lots of fans going there and saying, why are you so hard on Russia? The people are great, the country's great, it's so sunny, it's so wonderful. And we were like, yeah, but the regime is sort of different to the people, and you need to understand that. I kind of really hope that those people who came do understand that now, because the writing was always on the wall. I mean, every demonstration that Navalny held, you saw people being hauled off, and he was arrested so many times. And I mean, at the beginning of the 2000s, at Kursk in 2000, when this submarine went down, I don't know if any of you remember, and there were lots of Russian submariners on board. And when the mothers and the families were appealing to Putin and saying, do something, help us, one of them was literally sedated on camera. So, I mean, no one should have been surprised what the regime was actually like. But, of course, it has just got steadily worse. And from my stint there, summer of 2018, euphoria of the World Cup, it's gone downhill incredibly rapidly. And we had, I suppose, the sort of features of that time were all the unrest in Belarus from August 2020. We were just talking about this. Navalny was poisoned when I was there in Belarus, when all these protests were happening. 2021, he came back to Russia at the coldest, he chose literally the coldest day to return. I mean, it was like minus 27. We were all standing outside this airport waiting for him, going, couldn't you have just come back, maybe in a bit of a warmer climate time? And they shut down Transparency International then, which was one of the most important NGOs fighting for what little sort of democratic rights people in Russia have. And then we had the build up to war, and then the war. And since the war, it's been very difficult to cover Russia. That's when you left. basically there were new laws introduced in March 2022, so a couple of weeks after the beginning of the war, which criminalized with possible jail terms anything that could be deemed to be fake news or you discrediting the Russian armed forces, or even calling it a war. So we were all very nervous, and literally overnight the sort of few Russian independent journalists that were still there left, and quite a few of the foreign correspondents left, certainly kind of Russian correspondents working for British newspapers. And ever since then, it's been a sort of, you have to decide how you cover stories, whether you are putting your interviewees at risk, whether you're putting your Russian staff at risk. We wondered a lot of the time whether essentially the people that they wanted to get, the state, were Russian journalists explaining in Russian to Russians what their army, what their state, what their country, what their government was doing, so that they would be the main focus. But then they took Evan Gershkovich, who was a friend of all of ours. So that was a moment when I decided that actually I didn't want to be based in Russia anymore, and I would come back and forth. I didn't think I would actually go back to Russia. I left in sort of summer last year, a few months after he was arrested. But then so many things kept happening, like Yevgeny Prigozhin marching on Moscow. Then we have to renew our visas every 3 months to have a journalist accreditation in Russia. So that means you always have to be there to renew it. And so when I was there 3 months after that, his plane was shot out of the sky when we were near St. Petersburg doing a story about returning Wagner mercenaries. And sometimes the stories in Russia you simply cannot make up. And I think that's why it kind of just gets into your soul as a country. It's mad, it's exciting, it's wild. Prigozhin is just one example. Or returning Wagner mercenaries, people who've been released from jail, going to fight in Ukraine, coming back home, going on sort of drunken rampages through their villages and killing people, and this is happening more and more. Yeah,
I think as well, what you describe here is just, because I left so early in the war, I feel almost as though there are sort of two Russias that I'm sort of vaguely familiar with, right? The one that we lived in maybe up till about 2020, which was actually an extraordinary place where you could actually do really interesting reporting with weirdly not that much interference at all from the authorities. If you were smart about it and you sort of, and you go about it the right way, you could do some crazy stories and you could really sort of do it with really a minimum of interference. But then, that Russia also included sort of, Navalny protests that you could just go to and cover. They were stressful and they were risky, but they existed. Whereas the idea of public protest in Russia now is just absolutely inconceivable, and it just feels like sort of almost a before time and an after time, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely, no, I agree with that. I mean, there were protests for a while at the beginning of, when Navalny returned, there were big protests. And then when the war happened and when mobilization happened, a brave few people tried to come out. Around mobilization, especially because they didn't want to get sent to the front, but they were also saying no to war. But I often get asked by people in the UK, and I'm sure you do as well, why don't the Russian people stand up and protest this government? And you're like, did you not watch what we've been doing since 2012? Have you not seen what happens? And I think the strange thing is, like you say, you could cover the protests and they'd be kind of lively before 2020, but not many terrible things would go on. Like I've covered protests in Europe where it's much more violent, where everybody's throwing bottles and there's tear gas everywhere and all of this kind of stuff. Russia and Belarus are basically people going out into the street sort of saying, no, we don't like what you're doing, holding up a few posters, and they just get nabbed and put in a paddy wagon, and then they're in jail for a few days. And then the trouble is, once you get into that cycle as a civilian, things become more and more difficult. Things might get difficult for you at school, or they might, your state employer might fire you, and it just sort of escalates. And the dangerous thing in Russia is basically the long hand of the law, because once you're in the court systems, it's incredibly hard to get out of them, and it is not a fair or just society.
Yeah. I think, what underlies a lot of the things you said is that really, there is no rule of law in Russia, and almost what you're sort of the protesters you refer to, they would almost sort of be exaggeratedly law-abiding. There's no throwing of bottles or rocks at the police, but we're just here, demonstrating our will. But then it's kind of the other side that's really sort of, not obeying the law, shall we say?
But then, yes, absolutely. And the irony is that all of these sort of significant characters on all sides are trained in law, in Russian law. Like Putin's got a legal background. Navalny was a lawyer. Who's that? I can't remember the girl on his team who would go on those hunger strikes with the long blonde hair and the Sobol.
Yeah, Sobol.
I think Medvedev also a lawyer. You kind of have to know the law to get around the law. I mean, I think that's the case in any country. But that's very much the case in Russia. And, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, talks endlessly about international law and how Russia is law-abiding. It's so much a part of their narrative that they follow the law to the absolute letter, whether it's domestic or international. And you have to know how to use it to abuse it, which they do extremely well.
I think it's telling as well that I don't know about you, but in the sort of last 2 years, covering trials where the outcome has become an enormous part of my job, and I spend a lot of time following court proceedings, and in a way that I never really anticipated that I would on the Russia beat.
And they're so depressing.
They're so depressing.
Because such brave people who've done very little go, and they know that they're just going to get locked up. And I don't know how many of you know these sorts of names, but Sasha Skochelenko, for example, is an artist. Luckily, she's been freed now. We'll talk about the prisoner swap, I'm sure, in a moment. But an artist from St. Petersburg who just wrote on a supermarket labels. I can't remember exactly what she wrote, but basically trying to alert people to what had happened to the war crimes of Bucha. And she was reported on by, some old babushka who was sort of shopping for her buckwheat. And she was jailed for, she was in, something like 8 years. And she had all sorts of medical problems, and there were real concerns that she wouldn't be able to get out. Ilya Yashin, who was one of the key figures after Navalny died, you read the sort of closing testimony of some of their closing statements of some of these people whose trials happened over the past year, or Oleg Orlov, who was a big figure in Transparency International. The things that they say are so brave. They do not mince their words. They say exactly what they think about the regime. And then they go straight to jail. and you have these wonderful people still who do come to the courtrooms and show their support, and who are students and just sort of brave Russians who can't really do anything much, but at least they can sort of be there and make heart shapes to Yashin or whoever it is. Absolutely. That's always quite heartwarming.
Yeah. I wonder, a slight sort of change of topic perhaps, but I think something that I often tried to communicate while I lived in Moscow is that even as the mood music was so dark in every way, Moscow was an incredibly nice place to live, and always becoming nicer as well. I wonder if I think that's a very hard thing to express, because it's so clashed with the grain of sort of what you're expected to cover and what you need to cover. But it was very true, and it was sort of like the underlying reality of life there.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that it's like Joburg.
Yeah,
exactly. You sort of say that they're hardship posts, but actually life can be really quite good there. Yeah. How many of you have been to Moscow? So you, presumably the rest of you are hoping that you'll be able to go sometime soon. So I wrote an article at the beginning of the war, a few days into it, how Moscow looks exactly the same, but is totally transformed, which was basically an incredibly sort of emotional response to the fact that I felt that its whole soul had been ripped out. Lots of people who had left this terrible war that Putin had started essentially for very little reason. And a year and a half later, I slightly felt that that actually Moscow looked the same and felt the same, in that new restaurants were opening all over the place. They had been through COVID, they still are now. They've weathered the sanctions much better than anybody thought that they would, and especially in Moscow, you don't really, people don't like the war, but they're able to carry on living in a pretty cool way. You can still go to cocktail bars and drink great cocktails. You can still go dancing in, what was it called, Mutabor. Not that they've let me in for a very long time. It's a great club, by the way. It's like the Russian Berghain.
Something like that, yeah.
And so it's weird, and I think it had changed very dramatically. I mean, sort of the urban myth that's discussed about Moscow is that Sobyanin, the mayor, after the Bolotnaya protests in 2012 and 2013, basically realized that to stop people from recognizing that they don't have all of the rights that they should have, he would just make their kind of middle-class existence extremely nice. So it is nice. The parks are great. The lighting is great. The sort of street architecture is pretty cool, except for the pavements, which go funny every winter. And then someone makes a lot of money by repairing them. But it is an exciting, cool place to live.
Yeah, and also often very normal. In a sort of, it feels very sort of like a big European city ought to.
Yeah, and they kind of want it to feel like that. I mean, I remember when I first went there in 2018 at the Bolshoi, which is really traditional state stuff and controlled by the state and everything else. There was a friend of mine who was conducting. He'd come over from the UK, and he was conducting a Benjamin Britten opera, whose name I've forgotten. But essentially, it was about lots of men on a boat. I'm describing this very badly, so you'll have to. I apologise to any opera connoisseurs here, because I should have tried to remember this. But it was literally the most homoerotic thing that I've seen, and it was on the grand stage at the Bolshoi. It wasn't at the main stage, but it was on the second stage. And I talked to my friend, the conductor, about this afterwards, and I said how peculiar that this is being shown at the Bolshoi. In a country where that is sort of not what they want to project. And he said, well, I think it's on two levels. They want the kind of intelligentsia to feel, and this was 2018, remember? They want the intelligentsia to feel that the city is a bit like London or Paris or New York, and it has this sort of cultural aspects of a city like that. And then on the secondary level, and plenty of people in the chorus wouldn't even have noticed the undertones of the performance. On a secondary level, for the majority of people, they won't see it at all, and they'll accept Putin's argument that this is a very conservative, paternalist society, and that's that. And it was this sort of dual existence, which I found really interesting.
A nice way someone phrased that to me once was like, the harshness of the laws are mitigated by the selectivity of their enforcement. So you can always sort of avoid coming under the kibosh if you need to.
Yeah, but I guess
until you can't.
Until you can't, because I think, and this has been the case since Soviet times, is that they will make an example of somebody, and then everybody is scared, and that's the nature of repression, to make people scared, which is why so many people left. And I think, for those people who've left, that sense of fear is still frozen into their minds in a way, and it feels weird to them that actually life in Moscow continues as it does, and not everybody is operating in a sort of sense of perpetual fear. But for those people who might be against the regime, the state wants them to be scared, and that's how they control them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I find with Russians living here, of which there are obviously very many. And as time goes by, some begin to go home for visits or even to leave, and they are, if they're not part of that kind of very politically active but small minority, they can live.
Yeah, and they have a much nicer life. They can't get it out here.
Yeah.
They weren't very welcome. They don't get Schengen visas. I'm sure you probably have lots of Russian friends here, and it's really difficult. So a lot of people have gone back, just hoping that there isn't another round of mobilization. But the thing is, I mean, you're reporting on Russia now. I've been having a sabbatical. It's been wonderful. But I think that it is. And I feel that it's marginally less dangerous than it was in the early months and year of the war, because Putin's got the upper hand and he's winning and he's sort of sitting pretty, and his multipolar world is going pretty well, and the BRICS countries don't really care about Ukraine particularly. You speak to people from India who are like, why don't you care? Why should we care about Ukraine? You don't care about our issues. This is a Western issue. And so I think he feels, in journalistic terms, if you're in Moscow now, for a long time we were totally not invited to any Kremlin engagements, and they wouldn't respond to us at all. All of a sudden now they're inviting us to events all the time, which I think is really indicative of the fact that they are feeling pretty confident.
Yeah. I wonder what your experiences of sort of the country outside Moscow were in the years of your reporting, and how it differed. Or perhaps outside the big cities.
I guess I'll just talk about some adventures.
By all means, that's what we love.
One of the best adventures, although I did groan about it at the time, it's always weird how sometimes you're like, oh God, this is so crap, I'm up in the Arctic, it's just so long, we can't feed anything, it's so difficult. In fact, it was just incredible. We were, on boats going up the river trying to find mammoth bones from the Pleistocene era, because it was a story about the melting permafrost, which is a massive issue, and the kind of story that we could cover before war happened. And everywhere that we've gone, people have been incredibly warm. And actually, I think I would say this even since the beginning of the war. People are much, they may tell you that you're from the West and that NATO is a terrible, it's all their fault and it's all our fault and Russia's just defending itself. But they're still really civil. Whereas sometimes, and welcoming, and sort of will take you into their home and give you tea, and if they talk to you, I mean, people are more hesitant to talk to you, but they're not violent, touch wood yet, or really hostile to Westerners in a way that I've seen in Europe. They'll be like, damn fake news journalists, and they'll try and, they'll rough you up and they'll come and do V signs behind your live shot. That wouldn't happen in Russia. They are much more orderly, and I think it's because they're scared of the law. So they kind of behave well to foreigners in a way that almost we don't in other countries in the West. And in Belarus that was the case too.
Oh, no doubt, yeah. I wonder, we ought to talk about the prisoner exchange and our release and sort of what happened in the last year. So our friend Evan Gershkovich was arrested almost coming up for 2 years ago now. Well, almost a year and a half. And that was when I decided not to go back to Russia because, it sort of comes very real when you actually, you're not just writing about names, but someone you actually know is in jail. And
a foreign correspondent.
Absolutely, yeah.
I left the last trip that I thought I was going to do after doing about 9 more than I wanted to after I left when Evan was arrested, was Navalny's death. And I was glad that I was able to go back there. I'd been in Israel for 2 weeks, then Navalny died. It was so upsetting, I think. Like, if there are 2 moments that were incredibly upsetting, the beginning of the war, Evan's arrest, Navalny's death, was, even though all of us should have known that this was entirely possible, it was incredibly difficult to accept. Like, even now I feel like crying talking about it. I do about the war too, but I've got more used to that. And I thought that would be the last time. And then the Crocus City terror attack happened quite shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
And when Islamic State of the, where are they? What are they called?
Khorasan, the Central Asian crowd.
Went in and killed. How many people? Anyway,
several hundred. Certainly.
A terrible number of people. So, and I did not expect to be going back then, and I was pretty depressed about the state of Russia and the state of Ukraine, which is obviously much more depressing, and all these terrible things that were happening. And then a few months later we had this prisoner swap, which was literally the best news that I have ever had in my entire life, because everybody who you have reported on pretty much and who we cared about, and who, was released. So Sasha Skoczylenko, Vladimir Karamurza, Ilya Yashin, Evan, Alsa, the Radio Free Europe journalist, Paul Whelan, who had been in jail for like 6 years and had slightly been we kind of kept trying to report about him, but he was just sitting there as other people got swapped. He was like, what about me? And it was just incredible. And I think it was real testament to the fact that a lot of people all around the world had been putting an unbelievable amount of behind the scenes work into trying to get them out. Especially Evan's mother.
I think if you ever doubt what one person can do, you need to read the Wall Street Journal story about Evan's mother.
Yes, you do have to subscribe for quite a lot of money to the Wall Street Journal, but it's worth reading that article. But she lobbied. She basically, she'd grown up in Leningrad, quite near to where Putin was. She'd left the Soviet Union, and they'd brought up their 2 children in the States. And she, as soon as it started, basically researched everything that she possibly could about prisoner swaps, about the guy who was in jail in the States, who was sort of the key linchpin of the deal for Putin. What was his name? Who did the murder in the... Krasikov. Yes, Vadim Krasikov?
Vadim Krasikov, yeah.
Who'd murdered...
The Berlin bicycle murder.
Yeah, exactly. He'd gone and shot someone in the Berlin Tiergarten. He was sort of a Chechen assassin, wasn't he?
He was a Georgian Chechen assassin, actually.
There you go.
There's a local link.
Georgian Chechen assassin who killed a Chechen warlord. But
sorry,
was
a Russian assassin who killed a Georgian Chechen. My bad. Yeah.
Okay. And he was an FSB guy, and Putin wanted him back. And then Navalny was supposedly part of the deal. But I just don't think that, I literally do not think that Putin was ever going to let Navalny out at any point. So if anyone really bought that argument, I just don't know what they were thinking. But anyway, it worked out in the end. And Ella Millman, Evan's mother, had literally gone and she'd flown to Davos to talk to Scholz's spokesman. She'd
lobbied the German Chancellor.
Yeah, she'd spoken to everyone she could in the Biden administration. She'd really pulled every string she could to get her son home. And and they all did it. So I think it's testament to the fact that, and it must be difficult for all of you to know when you might go to Russia and what use you might put Russian to and all the rest of it. But I really, really, as someone who speaks incredibly bad Russian, really regrets it. I really think it's so important that there are people who understand Russia and who understand the country and who understand the culture, who can be involved in this kind of capacity, whether it's directing policy or whether it's, whatever capacity it can be. We need people who understand and love Russia. And who can, affect that kind of change, not just on a individual level like that, but also on a sort of macro level, like trying to affect some sort of resolution to this terrible war, which I don't see ending anytime soon.
How are we doing for time? 5 minutes left? Yeah. Okay, cool. Then we'll go to questions. So I guess for the final question then, do you ever see yourself going back to Russia? In any capacity?
I really feel sad about the possibility of not going back. Mm-hmm. I think that things would have to change quite considerably. And, at the end of the day, I would be able to go back now. I wouldn't necessarily get a journalist accreditation because the Foreign Ministry is very selective about who they give them out to. Like my successor, it took about 1.5 years to get a journalist accreditation for him, which is why I kept having to go back all the time. It's like a fight for journalists. You're like sucking up to the Foreign Ministry saying, what's happened about our accreditation? And they sort of dangle it over your head. You can, as a British citizen, go to Russia if you get the visa anytime you want, but will you be at risk? I don't know. None of us know. That's why you're here. That's why you're not working there. The trouble is we just don't know what they might do. And you talk to my management, for example, and they say, oh, well, Evan was probably taken because he was half Russian or completely Russian, and Putin doesn't like Russians, and maybe that was the case with the Radio Free Europe journalist too, but maybe it wasn't, and maybe he could come after a Brit, and you just don't know. So at the moment I'm not going to go back. But I hope in my lifetime to have gone back, because there are many places that I haven't visited, even though I've visited lots and loved it, and probably seen more of the country than many Russians have. But I haven't been to Kamchatka, and I want to do that. I haven't been to Kazan, and I want to go there. I haven't been, there are plenty of places I still want to go, and I really miss Moscow. So hopefully you'll all get to go sometime soon, and you. Would you go back?
Well, I've always thought that, like, I definitely hope I haven't been there for the last time in my life. But again, like, you know, I think being there right now, you have to make calculations, right? You have to, you know, it's just having that sword of Damocles hanging over you at any given point is just really quite frightening and stressful. And, you know, I just always thought I'd wake up in the night and being like, what the hell am I doing here?
Yeah, why am I bothering? I mean, I really felt that. Yeah, why, you know, do I want to go to jail for a story for Sky? I don't think so.
Yeah,
you know, I really respect the value of journalism, but the trouble is at the moment, I think it's very difficult to do the kind of journalism that you'd want to do. I think it's very important to be in Russia and to cover it and to talk to people about how they feel and not to sort of engage in wishful thinking that a lot happens, I think less so now, but, you know, people in the West or policymakers in the West saying, oh, Putin's never going to win this, and, you know, the economy is going to crumble and the people are going to rise up against him and all of that. You're just like, no, they're not. I mean, literally, do you want to watch some of my pieces? They are not. But I think it's very difficult to get scoops as a foreign correspondent in Russia. I mean, I think it's always been difficult to get scoops as a foreign correspondent in Russia. Normally it's the local, brilliant, independent crews who are doing it. And we slightly jump on the bandwagon and hopefully give them enough credit. I think we do. But I think that's the case now, that it's Medusa working from outside the country, or a lot of journalists outside the country making calls inside who are able to do better journalism than, or different journalism, more kind of investigative stuff than you are at the moment, when if you talk about what's happening in the Russian armed forces, you're thrown in jail, you know, I mean, so they do have us scared, but at the end of the day, it is important to cover repressive regimes, because otherwise we wouldn't be, you know, journalists still go into Iran, there are journalists in China. It's very difficult to report from India. It's very difficult to report from Russia. It's still important to be there, I think.
And there is just nothing like being on the ground and being able to soak up the vibe, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do get people who are sort of prepared to talk still.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's something worth doing. But I guess it is. You know, it is good. I think it's very difficult also as TV. You can't cover a country as TV and not be there, because you've got to film it, you know. But it is quite a lot easier as a print person to make calls. Like the FT does incredible reporting on Russia. You know, the sort of small team that they have do absolutely brilliant scoops and everything else, as does Reuters, by the way, and your team in Russia are very brave and do get good scoops. And I just hope that, I mean, I think the Kremlin feels that they're not going to kick somebody like Reuters out, but you don't know any of this. But I definitely think that it is easier to cover repressive regimes as a newspaper journalist, because you can call people up and they don't have to show their face, and you can do anonymous sources and all the rest of it. TV, it's quite difficult, but then again, you get a flavour and you get to see the country, and people can see sort of, it just gives a different dimension. And
you can't hide from the police when you're carrying a camera around either.
No, you can't. You know. But it makes good for television when they do that in front of the camera.
Yeah, no doubt. Cool. So should we go on to questions?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for what I'm sure we could all agree has been a really fascinating discussion. It gives us a lot to think about, not only your work and your life there and reporting there, but also the situation, the elections, what the future may look like, especially in a time when we've got elections coming up in Georgia as well. So it's really, really interesting to hear from you both. Thank you so much. Let's give Diana and Felix to be one with them.
This question kind of picks up what you were talking about at the end. I was studying in Moscow, working an incredibly low-level journalism job. Can amazing happened, and I chose to quit and leave, and it kind of felt like this big choice in this symbolic moment. And I was just wondering how we kind of reconcile the symbolic exit of professional journalists like yourself from Russia and to kind of boycott the country because you feel like your freedom to report is being compromised or your independence or rights being threatened? And how do we kind of balance that with the insight to Russia and the eyes and ears on the ground that are so important that we so need?
It's a really interesting question. It's something I really wrestled with, and it's kind of good because we've both got sort of different perspectives here. But for me, I'm half German. I've grown up with this sense of guilt about what the Germans did in the war, and what the Nazis did in the war. And I definitely felt when the war started, and I just felt terrible guilt. I felt guilt that I was still there. I felt that to make a stand and to show our disgust, we should leave. I don't think that journalists necessarily made a symbolic boycott. I think that the Russian journalists were leaving because it was dangerous, right? I don't think I've ever seen it or really felt that it was characterized as a symbolic boycott unless on an individual basis, which I can understand. And I certainly had endless conversations with my team and my management who were amazing and really were extremely helpful, like hour-long conversations every day about whether we should still be there and what we should be doing and whether it was worth staying. And I think that we were cautious about how we operated. So when the new laws came in, we didn't call it a war for a while. But you can make it quite clear in your reporting sort of where you stand. You can say this, as the Kremlin would like us to call it, special military operation. It's pretty apparent from your tone of voice that you think it's completely absurd and that everybody knows that you're talking about a war. I don't feel that that our journalism was ever really compromised. I just feel that there were clearly some stories that we weren't able to tell. But I think that that's the case, that just is the nature of reporting on a repressive regime. And as I said, if you decided to boycott all of these places, then how would you get coverage? So I found it very hard personally to reconcile, the fact that I felt such visceral sadness at what was happening. And I remember, sitting on a bus as the first time when those massive attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure happened and just sort of reading what had gone on that morning and just weeping on the bus and looking around at everybody else and thinking, are you not seeing what's happening? Are you not reading this? What do you think? But at the same time, I do think it's important to be there, and I am glad that we stayed. And it was very difficult. And actually, just as another addition to that, we kind of owed it to our Russian colleagues as well. We've had a bureau open Sky News has had a bureau in Russia since Soviet times. And if we shut down the bureau, that's very loyal people's livelihoods gone. We could have brought them all out and their families. A lot of people did that. They didn't really want to go. It wasn't necessarily necessary. And we just had to work out whether we were making the right choice all the time. But there were times when we had a plane ticket booked every night and it would roll over and we were just playing it by ear, But I think that my management made the right decision, and I do believe that it's important to cover these places. And also, once you leave, you've made a statement very difficult to get back in or go back in. And I think for Sky, they weren't going to risk that, and they would prefer to be cautious about our reporting for a while, but not leave altogether. And I don't feel that my journalistic principles were compromised.
Yeah. We both represent organizations that are still in Russia. And I think for Reuters, the position was sort of like, well, we've been here since 1870, and, what are we going to do, just leave? And also, what you say about Russian employees is incredibly relevant, right? Because, if you have a photographer in Russia, you can take them out of the country, but then what are they going to do then? What are they going to do now? And on the other hand, they could also get drafted if they stay in Russia, So it's a thicket of sort of moral dilemmas, and there is no clear answer to it, to my mind.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Thank you. With the rise of disinformation, so you hear a lot about for example, the GRU having people with false social media accounts spreading fake stories that are being directed. And you talked about the Skripal affair as well, the level of disinformation that shrouded the truth there. How does a journalist navigate such an environment where there's a lot of the time conflicting stories that try to stoke division? And kind of what is the role of traditional media within such environments?
I think trying to expose what the truth is. I mean, trying to, you know, it's like the BBC has their new BBC Verify. This is an amazing thing about OSINT, sort of Bellingcat-style investigative journalism, is that you can be pretty forensic about how you expose lies. And I think that is an important part of our job. But it's the challenge that we all face. And Russia has done a very good job of sort of, I mean, their propaganda, by the way, is incredibly effective, and it's really very good. I mean, this is what I'm always astonished about. It's not. I think sometimes people in the UK think, propaganda just must be really clunky and crap. Actually, if you watch state TV, it's really exciting and dramatic, and there's a lot in there which feels like, which has a lot of sort of kernels of truth. So it is hard to strip away what's right and what's wrong. You can understand why the Russian people totally believe what the government is telling them, because sometimes you're watching, 60 Minutes, and it's like a kind of game show. It's like a game show. There's crazy music and there are exciting camera angles, and it's just like, whoa, you're there with the troops on the front. It's exciting, and then, it's really compelling stuff. They're very, very good at it. A lot of their propaganda films coming out of Donbass are, some of their theatre plays. It's really effective. Like who's the guy who sings? Who's the guy with the blonde hair? Shaman. I mean, his songs are incredibly catchy, right? It's not like he's a total Kremlin. I mean, he probably appeared and the Kremlin decided he was helpful for their purposes. But his songs are great. I mean, once you've got them in your head, you can't get rid of them. And it's just a sort of example of how, I mean, it's not totally to your question of disinformation, but I suppose it just shows how compelling the Russian narrative can be and why so many people there believe it. And sort of disinformation more broadly, exposing disinformation for what it is one of the big challenges of all news organizations. And, we have whole departments who are busily trying to make sure that when Israel says that it had specifically targeted this, whether that's true or not, or whatever it may be. I mean, what would you add, Felix?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. Again, I come from a news agency background, which kind of to the layman would be it's mostly journalism for journalists, right? It's like we send stuff to Sky or to the BBC or whatever, and it's often not read by the actual consumer because it's really dry often, but it's just about, it is just the pure fact, basically. I mean, that's what we tell ourselves anyway.
You're the first people there because we have to take our information from you, so it's pretty important
what we pride ourselves on.
Agencies do.
My boss will be very pleased to hear that.
One question in there as well.
You all, after that, which year that you came to Moscow? I also was in Moscow in 2012-13, this era, and also watched the change to 2016, though I left much earlier. But the impression that I get from both of you is just kind of watching how basic, what we call civil rights, disappear over time. It didn't happen overnight. What did you all see in your time in Russia that would be a lesson for us in the West in terms of watching civil rights disappear slowly?
I mean, I always think that people in the West need to recognize how lucky they are to be worried about the problems that they have, because I always think it's surprising. Somewhere like Moscow, it looks the same as a city like London, but if you're arrested for going out to protest and you're scared of saying certain things, it's just a whole different ball game, and I think we complain about our media and we complain about the BBC, and we can, and disappointingly, we now have politicians who try and undermine the BBC, or, which I think is an incredibly important institution, and we need it. At least we have still a free media. And you see the way that the media has been absolutely savaged. I mean, there are some brave journalists still in Russia doing good stuff. But I think what we in the West should take away from these sorts of experiences in Russia is that we're incredibly lucky still to have democratic systems that do function pretty well, and we should work really hard to safeguard that rather than sort of denigrating the institutions that we do have, because the institutions are sort of all we have and we need to safeguard them. I feel that quite strongly, and I think that sometimes we can become very complacent. We can sort of you sort of have to compare the problems that you have with problems that other people have in other societies where, I mean, we can always be comparing ourselves, can't we? And we're not. It's not as though the people in Moscow are in Gaza, but there are certainly, we need to safeguard our democracy because it is really worthwhile, and you really notice that in Russia.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, and I think to that point, it's always kind of restorative to remember that kind of on paper, Russia is a democracy, right? It's constituted as a democracy. It has political parties, it has elections, but just none of these things are real, And what underlies it all for me is just that the lack of the rule of law, right? And the lack of the ability to expect that if you go to trial, you will get a judge who is not taking orders, and, and that the police will treat you fairly. That is all that separates us from what is happening there, to my mind.
We'll have one final question.
Yeah, I want to know how it, first of all, as a non-Russian speaking journalist in Russia, whether you notice a difference in treatment from Russians who are trying to get stories off of compared to journalists in Russia that speak Russian, and also from your own perspective, how that feels. Were there occasions where you're sort of in a room with two Russians battling away? Is it intimidating? Is it embarrassing? Do you feel aggressively British in that we are it's been great at learning other people's language as a general?
Yeah, I mean,
how does that feel?
So I think as a foreign correspondent, you're always going to have situations where you don't speak the language of the place that you're in. And at least I speak German and French, so I'm sort of, but I really hoped that my Russian would improve, and it really didn't. So I was like, okay, my brain's certainly got to an old age stage, and it's just not soaking it up. I always had a Russian team around me. Cameraman's Russian, producer is Russian, producer did all the translating. She's the one who's doing the hard work trying to get people to talk, sort of, via Telegram or whatever it is, setting up the interviews and stuff like this. And she would sometimes complain, and I can just about do vox pops on the street, and also I can, sometimes it works in your favor and sometimes it doesn't. But sometimes she'd be like, God, it's just much easier for me to go and do vox pops without you because, they're more likely to talk to me. But actually, I just think the flavor of what they say can be quite different. And they'll probably say something to me which is more insightful. It can kind of work both ways. Did I feel comfortable about the fact that I didn't speak Russian in lots of situations? Not really, but I just kind of got used to it. And the great thing is, thank God, is thanks to sort of Google Translate and Telegram Translate, you can read a lot of stuff quite simply. But I have no doubt that it would have been better if I'd spoken Russian. And I said to Sky when I went there, can I do an intensive course before I start? And they were like, oh, don't worry about it. None of our correspondents have ever learnt Russian. You'll just be there a couple of years, don't worry, it'll be fine, you'll always have a translator. 6 years later, it would have been just infinitely better. Of course, they paid for lessons, but I never did my homework, so I remained pretty bad. But I think you just have to accept that, your journalism sort of is one thing. Of course, it might be different if you spoke the language, but as I said, like a foreign correspondent, you're not going to be able to speak Farsi or everything. You're always going to be relying on fixers and local people, and they are your absolute support and backbone. And I miss my Russia team so much, and they were incredible, and they're incredibly brave to keep doing what they're doing. And it really, it's an impressive thing to be doing, and I'm very grateful to them.
Yeah. I mean, like, so I do speak Russian. I learned it before I went, but I now live here. I don't speak Georgian. I go to Armenia. I don't speak Armenian. I go to Azerbaijan. I don't speak Azeri. And what you find is that, like, you know, your hand is often being held by people far more experienced than you who've lived here for 30 years or whatever. And, you know, a lot of the institutional memory will go down through like the cameraman or the photographer or something like that. You know, they will be the people who know people. They will also have the language skills. You know, they will sort of be holding your hand in many ways, even, you know, and so, yeah, you get very, very grateful to sort of local staff who don't change, who stay here for a very long time and who are sort of really your sort of eyes and your ears in many ways.
And it's your cameraman normally who's the one dealing with the police.
Oh, absolutely.
And that institutional knowledge is really important. You know, my Vadim, he's just got this manner. He can kind of keep them on side. If I started talking to them as a Brit, it would be, I mean, you know, just
absurd.
Get in the back of the van. Or they probably wouldn't. They'd just be like, this is too complicated. But yeah. Your local staff are always sort of under glorified and often underpaid. I mean, hopefully not the ones at Sky, but and often, as we see in so many countries, the people who get killed. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning, and I don't remember her name, but just seeing today this Ukrainian journalist who was killed in Russian captivity, which is terrible. A 28-year-old Ukrainian journalist trying to cover her own country.
Yeah. And I know, like, Reuters have had one cameraman, a Lebanese cameraman killed in the south, and also a security advisor killed in Ukraine in the last year. So yeah, you know, it does happen.
And I suppose they're not necessarily locals, but often it is local freelancers who get killed. And in Gaza, clearly, it's always locals, and so many of them. So it's been a really tough year for journalists.
Yeah.
Do any of you want to become journalists? Yes.
Yay.
Yes. Oh, well, you are already. Okay, well, keep at it. We need you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your questions, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. And thank you both again for a really, really, really interesting evening. Let's give them both a huge round of applause.